Hello everybody, it's Sarah and welcome to day 9 of Bookmas, and today I'm going to tell you how I doubled my reading in 2020. I know that there's always a lot of people around BookTube who want some tips and tricks on how to read faster, how to read more. And so I thought I'd talk about my personal methods, which might not work for a lot of people actually, but I talk about them and maybe some of these methods work for you. But before we get into that and into talking how I read and how I read more, let's talk about something else. And that is the fact that on BookTube there's very much a focus on reading a lot, which I don't think is a surprise at all, because as booktubers we have to read to have content in a way. I mean, sure, we can go a few months without reading as much and still have enough content to film, but it's unlikely that we can go like a very, very long time without reading a lot and that not have some type of repercussions on our content. It's basically the reason why I had a 2-year hiatus, 2017 and 2018, because I basically didn't read anything, and so I didn't have that much to talk about, and I didn't want to always just talk about the same books that I had read in the years before. And so if you're a booktuber, it's like very logical that you want to read a lot and that you want to get to the new releases as well, because it's about views as well, and new releases just get more views than old releases. That's the way the world works. However, something that we tend to forget, I think, is that BookTube is very much its own little sphere, and what is normal on BookTube isn't necessarily normal anywhere else. I mean, I remember like last year especially, I was so proud of myself because I had read 70 books, and that was more than I had ever read before. But then I looked at everyone else on BookTube and on BookTwitter, and they had like 100, 200 books, and I was like, what the fuck? How did they read that much? And I almost felt bad about myself because I wasn't able to read that much, or as much as all the other booktubers were. But then I looked at everyone else around me, IRL, in real life, and like, reading 70 books is not an average at all. It's like way above average. So I think for everyone watching BookTube, watching booktubers, and not being on BookTube themselves, I think it's very important to keep that in mind, that we shouldn't be like the normal. We aren't the normal. We aren't what you should strive to reach in terms of how much you read. And then also something else that I think we forget to talk about a lot is that everyone reads very differently. And that's also the reason why I actually don't like the phrase quality over quantity when it comes to reading, because it's kind of always used to almost shame people who read a lot, and implying that they're only able to read that much because they don't get anything out from the books, because they don't like actually get what the contents of the book is, and they read so quickly that they forget afterwards right away anyway. And I think that's not necessarily true. I think that can be true for some people. For some people, the maximum they can read is 1 book a month, and that is completely okay, because they have to read that book slowly, they have to kind of digest every single word, every single sentence in a book. They maybe then have to take the time of 1, 2, 3 weeks after that book to kind of digest the book as a whole before they can get into the next book. And that's completely fine and completely okay. And then for other people, it might be possible to read 100, 200 books a year and be like completely fine. Not completely fine, that's the wrong way to say it, but like still get quality from those books. Where for others, it might not be possible to read that much and still be able to get as much out of those books. And I think, I don't know, I think we just don't talk enough about how differently we read and how that's like okay to read differently. And so when I talk to you in this video about how I doubled my reading from 2019 to 2020 and how I read now, that is very much catered to myself, and I know myself well. I know how I read books, I know how I read different books from different genres. I know what I can do to like improve my reading, or improve the amount, not improve the amount, that sounds like it's better, but like increase the amount of books that I'm reading per month. And so yeah, let's talk about that. So in 2019, as I said, I read around 70 books, 55 of which were new to me, so no rereads among those 55 books. This year I am already at 130 books. My reading goal was 60 books, so I'm way past that. And I think I can get to 140 by the end of the year, or almost to 140. So my storage was full. But yeah, I actually way increased my reading in the second half of the year compared to the first half of the year already. And yeah, what was the main thing that changed for me from 2019 to 2020? I think the main thing that happened actually was that I started reading multiple books at a time. I now read about 6 books at a time. And so that already is something that I know won't work for a lot of people, because a lot of people need that just concentrating on one book at a time to get into the reading experience. And I don't need that typically. I can get into books if I read one book at a time, 2 books, 3 books, 4 books, doesn't matter. But for me it's often easier to read multiple books at a time, because that way I manage to read more pages per day. Because a lot of times I maybe won't exactly feel like reading a book right now, even if I generally want to read it. And so it's just way easier for me to say, okay, I'll read 20 pages to 50 pages of this book per day. And then I have 2 or 3 other books that I really want to read right at this moment now. And I'll get through all of them at the same time. And so what's very important to me though is, with this method of reading, that I know myself. I know what I want to read right now. I know what I need to read right now. I know how I read different books. I'm familiar with how I read each genre. For example, I know that with YA, I read incredibly quickly. I know that with adult high fantasy, it kind of depends. If it's a first book in a series, I typically won't read it as quickly because I still have to get into the world. But like the later in the series a book is, the faster I can read it. I know that I read classics very, very slowly. And because of that, I originally started just not reading only classics whenever I read a classic, but having kind of a side book while I also read a classic. Because with classics, I can often take the whole month to read them, and I don't want to read just a classic. Classics typically for me are books that I need a bit of motivation to read them. With classics, I usually won't feel in the mood to read them. And that doesn't mean that I won't enjoy them when I pick them up, but just that I need to force myself a little bit to pick them up. And that's something that I just noticed a lot in the past few years, that I am a mood reader. I very much do not force myself to read a book I don't want to read. That does not mean that I don't also set myself a TBR, because I have noticed a lot of times I have books that I do really want to read, but they're always the types of books that I know just, I'll start them tomorrow. I'll start them tomorrow. I want to read them, I feel in the mood to read them, but I'll start them tomorrow. And so my reading has improved a lot since I started reading multiple books at the time, because these books that I want to read, but that I'm never in the mood for reading, I just force myself to read them while I also read a book on the side that I'm actually really in the mood for and that I can fly through. And so because of reading multiple books at a time, it has gotten a lot easier for me to pick up books that I want to read, but that I also kind of have to force myself to read, because otherwise I'll read them tomorrow, or I'll continue tomorrow, or something like that. And with forcing myself to read them, that absolutely doesn't mean that I don't enjoy them. Like, if I don't enjoy a book, I will DNF it. But typically I enjoy them. I just never pick them up, you know? So I just thought that I'd go through the process of showing you how I pick the books that I read at the same time, just on my current TBR, and also how I pick how much of each book I read per day. Because if I read a lot of books at the same time, my second tip is to set yourself a daily page goal for each of those books. Because that way it's very easy for me to like know when I'll be done with a book and to know when I can start the next one and so on. And let me start with the book that was in my TBR jar for this month, because that's usually the book that I'll feel the least like reading, because obviously it's the least choice I have in any matter. For me this month, that was Lady Gregory's Complete Irish Mythology. This is a 550-page book. It's quite big for one of my TBR jar books. Usually the books from my TBR jar are a little bit thinner. And so what I do is I first look at the page count, 550 in this case, as I said. The second thing I do is I look at how many chapters this book has. This book has about 110 chapters. And so I then kind of divide the chapters into how long I want to take to read this. For a 500-page book, 550-page book, I will typically say, okay, between 10 to the whole month, depending on how much I really want to read the book, depending on what genre the book is from. Obviously, with YA 500 pages, I can easily finish this in 10 days or even less. With an adult high fantasy, I will typically say 10 to 15 days. And with a classic, I would say 15 to 25 days. I will usually not like account for the entire 30 days because I do want to leave myself some days where maybe I won't pick this book up. But yeah, in this case, I said I want to finish this in 20 days. To finish this in 20 days, I have to read about 30 pages per day. I then look at how long the chapters are, how many chapters am I gonna read per day, and that's that. That's this book done, and I will read those chapters per day. I actually am a little bit slow going with this one. I have barely read 200 pages, so I do have to pick up my reading pace with this one. But that's the first book done already, the planning of my reading challenge. Then I have a second book that I'm currently reading, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was not on my TBR, and because of that I won't read this very urgently. I just kind of read whenever I feel like reading it, feel like picking it up. I mean, now I started wanting to finish this before my mid-month wrap-up, which is on the 15th, which means I have 5 more days to finish this, and I have, I think, 6 chapters left. I looked at how long the chapters are. I won't read a chapter per day because the chapters are quite short. I'll read 2 chapters per day and then I'm done. And that's that for this book. And once I'm done with this, I can start a new one. But yeah, that's kind of an exception in this case because usually, I mean, I do sometimes have those books that I just pick because I feel like reading them. That's what I mean. I have my TBR, but I know myself. And if I really feel like picking up a book, I won't stick to my TBR, just like ride or die, but I'm okay with not picking a book up in a month if I end up reading another book instead. So that's what this book is for example. And also something else, that's where it's important that you know how you read yourself. Because for classics, typically I wouldn't read as much as or as many pages as I'm reading of this one right now. But I know that I read Oscar Wilde very quickly, more quickly than I usually read classics, so I know that I can read more pages of this per day and I can calculate for that. And I think that's the ultimate thing for reading more. Just know yourself. Know how much of a mood reader you are. Know how much you can force yourself to read books. Like, I know some people, even if they want to read a book, if they feel like they're forced to read a book, they won't have fun reading that book. For me, if I know I want generally to read a book, I can force myself to read that book and still enjoy the book. I just don't like when someone outside forces me to read a book. I can't deal with that. But generally, it helps me a lot if I force myself to pick books up. And that's also how I got so fast in like getting rid of my physical TBR. Next book I have is The Three Musketeers. This one has about 70 chapters and it's 700 pages. This is quite a hefty classic. Usually with these classics, I would also like take the whole month. Gotta be honest, with 700 pages, maybe even take 2 months. Because I have noticed that typically with classics, I take very long to read them. Because when it comes to fantasy, I can read it very quickly. I'll get later into how I read fantasy, but I don't skim read, but I don't read it very closely. I don't read like every single word. Because typically in fantasy, it's not that important how the fantasy is written. It's more important like what the contents of the sentence is. What does the sentence say? There's not that much like beautiful language. And with classics, it's often very important that you read every single word. So typically I read classics very slowly. I typically don't read more than 20 to 30 pages a day, which in this case would mean I take the whole month for The Three Musketeers. However, I have already read one Alexandre Dumas so far this year, which was The Count of Monte Cristo. I knew I read The Count of Monte Cristo really quickly. By the end of it, I think I read 60 to 80 pages per day. So I know I'm completely fine in reading 50 pages a day of this one. I know this has 70 chapters, which means I can read 5 chapters a day easily. And so that's what I do. And sometimes if I feel like reading more chapters a day, then I read more chapters a day. Like, that's always an option. It's always an option to read more, as long as you still read the chapters that you want to read of the other books. But yeah, so that's with that book. Then I have Send Me Their Souls by Sarah Wolf, which is a high fantasy YA, so I know I can read this very quickly. And this is actually an exception this month, because usually I don't do what I do with this book this month. Because this is the last book in a series. This has about 430 pages, and I got this the day before yesterday. However, I want to, the day after tomorrow, film all the finished series on my bookshelves, and I want to have this finished by then. Usually I won't give myself just 4 days to finish a 400-page book, but I know this is YA, I know I enjoy the story, so that's what I did. I'm reading currently 100 pages of this per day, around 100 pages. It's 32 chapters, usually I go by chapters. It's 32 chapters, so I'm reading 8 chapters of this per day. And again, YA fantasy, I can read incredibly quickly, and I know that about myself. And so I typically also try, especially if I have a lot of high fantasy and classics on my TBR, I typically also try to read at least one YA on the side. Because that's something that I also do and that motivates me a lot. I try to, on the side, have at least one book that's either 200 to 300 pages or a YA fantasy, because I know I can read those books really quickly. And so if I have a lot of chunkers on the side that I take 10, 15, 20 days to read, I can still kind of have the satisfaction of constantly finishing books if I read some YA on the side. And so I don't get dragged down into a reading slump by feeling like I don't finish any books at all, because I do enjoy the satisfaction of finishing books. So yeah, this is also another tip. Know yourself, know which books you read easily, and at least 1 to 2 of the books that you're currently reading all the times, have them be books that you read very quickly. Then next, I have The Burning God by R.F. Kuang. And the thing I want to talk about with this one is, again, know your reading, because that's also something that I do. I know that once I get to the last 3 days of a book that I have scheduled, I usually push myself and read those 3 days in 2 days, or whatever I had plans for 3 days, I read in 2 days. And so yeah, that's another thing that's just like really important, to know yourself and to just, I don't know, read it really quickly. By the way, I will probably be done with this by the time you get to see this video today. But yeah, again, just know yourself. And that is also something with fantasy. The way I read it is very much not every single word in a sentence, often not even every single sentence. But the thing I do is I just look at the page. I kind of find the important sentences by just taking one look at the page, and then I read those sentences or paragraphs, and that's how I also manage to read really quickly. But again, that's not something that everyone can do. And I have also started, like, I think a lot of people are gonna call what I do skim reading, but believe me, it's not skim reading. Because when I skim read, I literally read 2 to 5 sentences of a page or lines of a page, and that's it. It's what I did with the latest Wheel of Time book I read, because it was so boring, so incredibly boring. But yeah, I read really quickly, and so that's also why I like to have a mix of different books that I read. I like to have a mix of adult high fantasy as well as YA high fantasy or shorter fantasy, as well as literary fiction, as well as classics, because I can read like all of them together because I read them very differently. And kind of having that difference in between the books just makes me enjoy reading more, because I feel like I'm getting less into a like trot and feeling like it's all the same all the time. And so yeah, that's why I enjoy having multiple books at the same time that I can read. That's just basically what I do, is I read multiple books at the same time. I know how I read each book. I account for that, and that is how I started reading more. And I didn't really have anything with like audiobooks. I know a lot of people say you can read more with audiobooks. I typically don't find that to be the case for me, because I can't like listen to audiobooks a lot. Like, I don't do a lot of things where I can listen to an audiobook on the side. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like maybe this video was less recommendations how you can increase your reading, but more just, you know, me talking to you how I read. But my 2 things that I would say is, if you can do it, read multiple books at the same time, because I do find it easier to read more pages in a day if I don't read 100 pages from one book, but if I read 30 to 40 pages from 3 different books. And then also set yourself a daily reading goal. Set aside time to read, which, by the way, that's something that I didn't talk about. I personally can read a lot because I'm a student who, especially since Corona hit, didn't work. I had a lot less time to read when I went to work, obviously. So if you have a full-time job, if you have part-time jobs, if you have children, of course those are all factors that might stop you from reading like I do. But I typically like to read in small increments every day, and then like I have twice a day where I sit down 1 hour and just read. And otherwise, between studying, I just enjoy, when I study for school, for example, to just take 10-minute breaks, 20-minute breaks, read a chapter in whichever book I want to read in right now, and go like that. So that's just basically my recommendation, is read multiple books, set yourself goals in how much you want to read, know yourself, know your reading, because like, if you don't know your reading, that's the best way to put yourself into a reading slump. Don't force yourself. That's also a good way to put yourself into a reading slump. And like, I mean, don't force yourself to read if you don't want to read. Don't force yourself to read a certain book, because sometimes that can be helpful. For me, it sometimes is, at least. And then also find just short times every day to read. You don't have to find like 1 hour at once always to read, but it can always help if you just find 3 times 20 minutes a day that you can read. And so yeah, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. Tell me in the comments down below how you read. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. All the links to my book club of Queen's Witches and Valkyries, where we read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman per month, are also in the description box down below, so go and check those out as well. And I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!